Okay, so today we're diving into something that sounds kind of, well, counterintuitive, to be
Uh,
honest.
yeah.
It's this idea called the disfluency effect, and I'm not even sure if I'm saying that right.
Disfluency. Yeah.
So the basic premise is that, like, if you make learning materials, a bit tougher to actually read, it
Hmm.
could actually help you remember the stuff better.
Hmm.
So think like weird fonts or audio that's kind of muffled.
Hmm.
Does that ring a bell? Have you heard about this?
Yeah, for sure. It's been making the rounds in educational psychology.
Huh.
And yeah, it's definitely one of those things that makes you go, wait, really?
Right, because it's like you would think struggling to even process how something looks or sounds would make it harder to learn, not easier.
You'd think so, right? It seems
Yeah.
counterintuitive.
Totally. So you've brought some really interesting research for us to look at today.
Yeah.
And I think the main thing we want to figure out for our listeners is, like, is this effect actually a real thing?
Yeah, that's the big question.
And if it is, does it mean we should all be switching to Comic Sans or something?
Well, hold on. Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, fair enough. But seriously, like, should this change how we approach learning?
Well, that's what we're going to try to uncover today.
Okay, so to really get into the nitty-gritty of this, there's this big meta-analysis we're going to focus on.
Right.
It was published in Educational Psychology Review back in 2018,
Okay.
and the authors are Shi, Zhu, and Liu.
I know that one.
Yeah, this is a serious piece of research.
Huh.
It actually combined data from 25 separate studies, like, wow, over 3,000 participants.
That's a lot of data.
Yeah, so this isn't just one little study that might have gotten a fluke result.
Yeah.
This is a big picture look at what the science actually says about this whole disfluency thing.
Very comprehensive.
Okay, so before we get lost in the weeds, can you just break down for us what perceptual disfluency really means? Like, what are we actually talking about here?
Sure. So at its core, perceptual disfluency is about how difficult something feels to process, like when you're reading or listening. And the key here is it's not because the information itself is hard, it's because of the way it's presented.
Oh, okay.
So let's say you're trying to read text in some really crazy font, like one of those super decorative ones that can make your eyes work harder just to decipher the letters. Or maybe you're listening to a podcast.
Ah, not this one, hopefully.
Right, not this one. But imagine if the audio was all choppy or the speaker had a really thick accent. That feeling of, oh, this is taking more effort just to understand, that's perceptual disfluency.
Okay, I'm getting it. So it's not about the content being difficult, it's about the form and the presentation.
Exactly, the way it's delivered.
Okay, so now let's talk about what really got the ball rolling on this whole disfluency research.
Uh-huh.
Like, what was that initial spark that made everyone go, whoa, maybe there's something to this?
Well, there was this study that really caught people's attention. It was done by Diamond Yeoman and some other researchers back in 2011.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that one.
And what they found was that when people were given learning materials that were harder to read because of the font they were in,
Like super tiny font or something.
yeah, maybe something like that,
Okay.
they actually remembered more of what they'd read later on. It was a small study, but the finding was pretty striking because it's so counterintuitive, right?
It is. You'd assume easier to read would equal easier to remember.
Exactly.
But this was like saying, no, make it a struggle, and you'll remember it better.
And that's what really grabbed people's attention. The idea that a simple change in the presentation of the material, like switching the font, could actually boost learning.
Right, it's like finding a learning hack, the shortcut.
And a super easy one to implement, potentially. I mean, you don't need any fancy technology or special training. Just change the font and boom, better learning.
Exactly. So everyone's excited, thinking this is the next big thing in education. What happens next?
Well, as with most things in science, more research is needed to really see if a finding holds up.
Oh yeah, that's how science works.
Right, you got to replicate it, try it with different people, different materials, see if it's consistent.
Makes sense. So more studies start popping up, and what do they find? Did they all support this initial promising result?
That's where things got a bit messy. Because while some studies did find similar positive effects of disfluency on, say, memory, others didn't, some actually found no effect at all, or even a negative effect.
Oh wow, so mixed results.
Yeah, very mixed. And that's always a red flag in research. It makes you question how robust and generalizable the finding really is. Like, is it a genuine phenomenon or just a fluke that happens under very specific conditions?
Right, so it's not as simple as disfluency equals better learning.
Not at all. It seems there's more to the story.
Okay, so that's where this big meta-analysis comes in, the one by Shi, Zhu, and Liu that we talked about.
Exactly. Because when you have a bunch of studies with different results, a meta-analysis is a really powerful tool to try to make sense of it all.
So for our listeners who might not be familiar with meta-analyses, can you explain how it works and why it's so valuable?
Sure. So think of it like this. A meta-analysis is a way to combine the results of multiple studies on the same topic to get a more accurate overall picture. Instead of just looking at each study in isolation, you're basically pooling all the data together and analyzing it statistically.
So it's like getting a bigger sample size, more data points.
Exactly. And that gives you more statistical power to detect real effects and to see patterns that might not be obvious in any single study.
Okay, that makes sense. And like you said, this meta-analysis was huge. It included 25 studies, over 3,000 participants.
Exactly. 3,135 to be exact.
Wow, that's a lot of data.
Yeah.
So what did this massive analysis tell us about the main question? Does making text harder to read actually lead to better recall and, better transfer of knowledge? Like, can you apply that knowledge in different situations?
Well, here's where the findings get really interesting and maybe a little bit disappointing if you were hoping for that easy learning hack. Because overall, Shi, Zhu, and Liu found no significant effect of perceptual disfluency on either recall or transfer of information from text.
Hmm.
When they crunched all the numbers, the average effect size for recall was a tiny, tiny negative 0.01. And for transfer, it was barely there, positive 0.03. So statistically speaking, these are basically zero effects. It means that across all those studies, making text harder to read didn't reliably improve how well people remembered the information or how well they could use it in new situations.
So that's a pretty clear no to the idea that disfluency equals better learning, at least not consistently.
Right. It seems that making your study materials difficult to read just for the sake of difficulty is unlikely to give you a real learning advantage.
Okay, so that kind of bursts the bubble on the initial excitement, I guess.
It does dampen the enthusiasm a bit, yeah.
But the meta-analysis didn't just stop there, right?
No, it didn't. They dug deeper.
Like, what else did they find?
Well, while disfluency didn't seem to boost memory or transfer directly, it did have an interesting impact on something called judgments of learning, or JOLs for short.
JOLs. Okay, I'm not familiar with that term.
So JOLs are basically your own predictions about how well you think you'll remember something in the future.
Oh, interesting.
Like if you were studying for a test and I asked you how confident you felt that you'd remember the material next week, your answer would be your judgment of learning.
Okay, so it's like how well you think you learned something, your own assessment.
Exactly, your metacognitive judgment about your learning.
Got it. So what did they find about JOLs and disfluency?
Well, the meta-analysis showed that perceptual disfluency actually reduced people's JOLs. They found a moderate effect size of negative 0.43.
Negative, so that means people felt less confident.
Precisely. When the material was harder to read, people felt like they weren't learning as effectively, even though the actual recall and transfer data didn't support that.
That kind of makes sense, though, right? If something is harder to process, you might assume you're not getting it as well.
Yeah, it's a natural assumption.
So it's like the disfluency itself is acting as a signal. Like, hey, this is hard, so I must not be learning it well.
That's a good way to put it. It's like a metacognitive cue.
Interesting. So our brains are kind of tricking us into thinking we're learning less just because it feels harder.
It seems that way.
Okay, so besides JOLs, did they find anything else interesting?
They did. They also looked at how disfluency affected the amount of time people spent learning, actual study time.
Okay, makes sense. What did they find there?
So this one's also pretty interesting. They found that disfluency actually increased learning time, and the effect size was a moderate 0.52.
So people spent more time on the harder to read stuff.
Yeah, especially when they were in control of the pace of learning, like in self-paced reading.
So it's like they were trying to compensate for the difficulty by putting in more effort.
Yeah, that's one interpretation. They're sensing the disfluency and trying to overcome it by spending more time.
But we already know that the extra time doesn't necessarily lead to better recall or transfer.
Right. That's the key takeaway here. Just because something feels harder and you spend more time on it doesn't guarantee you'll learn it better.
So it's not just about effort or time. It's about what kind of effort, how you're using that time.
Exactly. Efficient learning is about more than just how long you stare at something.
All right, now I want to touch on the theories behind all of this. There's this idea called disfluency theory, and then there's cognitive load theory.
Right. Two different perspectives on why disfluency might have an effect, and they kind of make opposite predictions.
Can you give us a quick recap of those theories? Like, what's the main idea behind each one?
Sure. So disfluency theory, which was proposed by Alter and Oppenheimer and a few other researchers, basically says that when we encounter something that's harder to process, it disrupts our normal kind of automatic way of thinking.
Like we're on autopilot and then suddenly we have to pay attention.
Exactly. So disfluency theory says that this disruption forces our brains to switch to a more effortful, analytical mode of thinking.
Like we have to really engage with the material.
Right. And the theory argues that this deeper processing is what leads to better learning outcomes, like better memory and understanding.
Okay, so that's the harder is better because it makes us think harder
hmm
argument.
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
What about cognitive load theory? How does that explain things?
Well, cognitive load theory comes from a slightly different angle. It focuses on the idea that our working memory, the part of our brain where we actively process information, has limited capacity.
Like there's only so much we can hold in our minds at once.
Exactly. And when we're learning, there are different types of mental effort or cognitive load that we experience. So there's intrinsic load, which is the effort required to understand the material itself, like how complex the concepts are.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then there's germane load, which is the effort we put into actually making sense of the information, like connecting it to what we already know or creating mental models.
So that's the good kind of load, the one that helps us learn.
Right. And then there's extraneous load, which is the mental effort that's caused by things that aren't actually part of the learning content, but make it harder to process.
Like a distracting environment or a really confusing layout.
Exactly. And cognitive load theory suggests that perceptual disfluency might actually increase extraneous cognitive load because our brains have to work harder just to decode the difficult format, the font, the audio, whatever it is. So instead of using our mental energy to understand the content, we're wasting it on trying to decipher the presentation.
So it's taking away resources from the actual learning.
That's the idea.
Okay, so disfluency theory says harder leads to better because of deeper processing. Cognitive load theory says harder leads to worse because of extraneous load. But the meta-analysis didn't find a clear effect either way. So what does that tell us about these theories?
Well, it suggests that neither of them provides a complete or universal explanation for how disfluency affects learning.
Like maybe it's more complicated than either theory suggests.
Yeah, it seems like it. The lack of a consistent effect on recall and transfer indicates that the mechanisms proposed by both theories, deeper processing versus extraneous load, might be more nuanced or situation dependent than initially thought.
So the takeaway is that it's not as simple as disfluency is good or disfluency is bad. It depends.
Exactly. And more research is needed to figure out those nuances, those specific conditions where it might be helpful or harmful.
Okay, so the meta-analysis didn't just look at the overall effect, right? They also explored if there were specific factors that might influence whether disfluency works or not, right?
Yeah, that's right. They looked at a whole bunch of potential moderators, things about the learners themselves, the learning materials, and how the studies were designed.
So like trying to see if certain types of people benefit more from disfluency or if it works better for certain subjects, that kind of thing.
Exactly. They were trying to find patterns, any clues as to when disfluency might be helpful or not.
Okay, so what kind of things did they look at specifically?
Oh, they looked at a whole laundry list of potential moderators. 3 main categories: participant characteristics, learning material characteristics, and experimental design characteristics.
Wow. Okay, break that down for us.
All right. So for participant characteristics, they looked at things like the learner's prior knowledge level. Did they come in knowing a lot about the topic, a little, or nothing at all?
Makes sense.
Then for learning material characteristics, they looked at what domain the material was in. Like, was it science, technology, engineering, math, social science?
Okay, different subject areas.
And then they looked at the pacing of the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Was it self-paced, where the learner controls how fast they go through the material, or was it system-paced, where the timing is fixed?
Okay.
Then the type of material. Was it static, like text on a page, or dynamic, like a video or animation? The modality, was it visual only, or did it involve both visual and auditory elements? And the medium, was it presented on a screen or on paper?
Wow, that's a lot of variable.
Yeah, and they also looked at whether the material included images along with the text, and whether the disfluency manipulation was font-related or audio-related.
So a really thorough examination of the learning materials.
Oh yeah, they were pretty comprehensive.
And then the last category was about how the studies themselves were designed.
Right. For experimental design characteristics, they looked at whether the study used a between-subjects design, where different groups of participants get either the easy-to-read or the hard-to-read version, or a within-subjects design, where the same participants experience both.
Okay.
They also looked at how long the learning phase lasted, the amount of time between learning and testing, whether there was a distraction task in between, and whether the participants knew beforehand that they were going to be tested.
So basically all the different ways you could structure a study on this topic.
Yeah, they really tried to cover all the bases.
All right, so with all those potential moderators, did any of them actually make a difference? Like, did they find any clear patterns of disfluency works better in these situations?
Well, that's where it gets a bit anticlimactic because the main analysis across all 25 studies found no evidence that any of those characteristics consistently and significantly changed the effect of disfluency on recall.
Oh, wow. So none of those things really mattered.
No, not in a statistically significant way across the whole body of research. It means that regardless of who the learner was, what they were learning, or how the study was done, the overall lack of a clear disfluency effect on recall pretty much held true.
Huh. So it's not as simple as saying disfluency works for some people but not others, or it works better for certain subjects.
No, it seems more complicated than that.
Okay, so what's the takeaway from all that moderator analysis?
I think the main takeaway is that context might not be as important as we initially thought.
Interesting.
Like, we were hoping to find specific situations where disfluency would be beneficial, but the data just didn't really support that.
So it's not looking good for disfluency as a reliable learning strategy.
Yeah, that's fair to say.
Now, I do remember reading something about them doing a separate analysis just for adults.
Yes, that's right.
Why was that?
Well, because the vast majority of participants in the studies they included were adults, they decided to do a separate analysis just focusing on that group to see if there were any patterns specific to adult learners.
Okay, so what did they find in that analysis?
So, again, no single factor emerged as a statistically significant moderator in this analysis.
So no smoking guns there either.
No, but they did observe a few interesting trends.
Oh, tell me more.
Well, several factors seem to be associated with worse recall for disfluent text in adults, even though these associations weren't strong enough to be statistically significant.
Like hints of an effect, but not definitive proof.
Exactly. So, for example, when the presentation of the material was system-paced, meaning the learner couldn't control how fast they went through it, there was a suggestion that disfluency might be linked to lower recall.
So if you're forced to read at a certain pace and the text is also difficult, that might be a bad combination for adults.
That's what the data hinted at, yes.
Interesting.
They also found similar hints that studies using a between subjects design, those with shorter time intervals between learning and testing, and those that didn't include a distraction task, might also point towards a negative relationship between disfluency and recall, specifically in adults.
Okay, so maybe if you're tested soon after learning, or if there's no break or distraction between learning and testing, disfluency might not be so helpful for adult learners.
That's one possible interpretation of these trends, yes.
So lots of interesting avenues for future research, but no firm conclusions yet.
Exactly. More data is needed to confirm these trends and to see if they generalize to other populations and learning contexts.
All right, now before we wrap up, there's one more important thing I want to ask about. When you're looking at big meta-analysis like this, one question that always comes up is there any publication bias?
Oh, yeah, that's an important consideration.
Because, sometimes studies that find exciting positive results are more likely to get published, while studies that find no effect kind of get buried.
That's right. And if there's a lot of unpublished research with null findings, it can skew the results of a meta-analysis and make it look like there's a stronger effect than there really is.
So did the researchers who did this meta-analysis address that issue?
They did. They used a few different methods to check for publication bias.
Like, how did they do that?
Well, one way is to look at a visual representation of the studies called a funnel plot. Basically, if there's no publication bias, the funnel plot should look symmetrical.
Okay.
Then they also did some statistical tests, like Egger's test and a rank correlation test, to formally check for asymmetry in the data, which could indicate bias.
Okay, so what was the verdict? Any sign of major publication bias here?
Based on those analyses, there wasn't strong evidence of a major publication bias in this set of disfluency studies.
Those is great.
Yeah, it means we can be more confident that the overall lack of effect we're seeing isn't just because a bunch of studies that found no effect never saw the light of day.
Right. The data we have is probably a fairly accurate representation of the research out there.
That's the conclusion we can draw from those bias checks, yes.
Now, one last thing I'm curious about. This whole idea of disfluency is about making the perception of the material more difficult. But could it be that there's a sweet spot? Like maybe a little bit of disfluency is good, but too much is actually harmful.
That's a really interesting point, and it actually ties into a concept that some researchers have proposed called the optimal level of perceptual disfluency.
Oh, tell me more about that.
So the idea is that there might be a kind of U-shaped relationship between disfluency and learning. A little bit of disfluency might be beneficial because it prompts us to engage more deeply, like we talked about with disfluency theory.
Okay.
But if you make things too difficult, it just becomes frustrating and overwhelming, and it might actually backfire and hurt learning.
So it's like finding the right balance. Not too easy, not too hard, but just right?
Exactly, like Goldilocks in the porridge.
Oh, perfect analogy.
But the problem is, the meta-analysis we've been discussing couldn't definitively answer this question about an optimal level.
Why not?
Well, because the way disfluency was manipulated varied so much across the different studies. Some studies used fonts that were just slightly unusual, while others used fonts that were almost impossible to decipher. And without a standardized way to measure and categorize the degree of disfluency, it's hard to say for sure whether there's a sweet spot and what that sweet spot might be.
Okay, so that's another area where more research is needed.
Definitely. We need more precise ways to manipulate and measure disfluency to really get at that question of an optimal level.
All right, so let's bring it all home for our listeners. If someone's listening to this and thinking, okay, should I be making my study notes harder to read now? Moo, what's the main takeaway message from all of this?
Well, based on this very comprehensive meta-analysis, the main takeaway is that there's not enough evidence to say that intentionally making your learning materials harder to process is a reliable way to improve your learning.
So not a magic bullet.
No, not a magic bullet. While disfluency might make you feel like you're struggling more and you might end up spending more time studying, those things don't actually translate into better understanding or memory in most cases.
So that shortcut to better learning, that learning hack we were hoping for, it's not really a thing.
Yeah, the data doesn't support it as a general strategy.
But the findings about judgments of learning and study time, those are still valuable insights, right?
Oh, absolutely. They tell us something important about how our minds work, how we perceive difficulty, and how that perception influences our learning behaviors.
So even though disfluency itself might not be a reliable way to boost memory, understanding those metacognitive effects, how we think about our own thinking, that's still useful knowledge.
For sure. It helps us understand how our minds interact with information, how we judge our own learning progress, and how we allocate our study time.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the disfluency effect, here's a final thought for our listeners to chew on. Even though deliberately making things harder to read might not be a proven strategy, could the feeling of difficulty still play a role in learning?
Interesting question.
Like if you're grappling with a challenging concept, not because of the font or the audio, but because the idea itself is complex.
Right, the inherent difficulty of the material.
Yeah, could that struggle, that effort, lead to deeper insights or a more robust understanding in the long run, even if it doesn't directly improve your recall on a test?
That's a great question, and it's something worth pondering. Does the process of wrestling with difficult ideas, even if it doesn't lead to immediate gains in memorization, contribute to a deeper, more nuanced understanding?
Yeah, maybe it's about the journey, not just the destination.
Maybe so. It's something for all of us to reflect on as we continue to learn and grow.
Thanks for diving into this fascinating topic with us. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See you then.